Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Premier Study in Investing. Today, we're going to be looking at the book called China, Fragile Superpower. Came out in 2008. Basically, we're going to be looking at a number of different titles related to the FSOT exams. FSOT is an exam for American diplomats, people trying to pass that. But, it's also just interesting for anyone who's interested in, international relations, economic development. Just did a book on why nations fail. Very interesting about how to govern. The sharing of power, distribution of rights, and things like that. This book is very interesting. I'd like to draw your attention to the oxymoronic phrase, fragile superpower. Interesting, right? Well, the purpose of the book, it says the Chinese is to basically outline Chinese political environment in order to avoid future conflict between the United States and China. So the way I organize my notes is basically there's a couple of nations that are really important in this book. So the United States being one, there's a whole chapter dedicated to the United States. Japan, North Korea. I did a section on global economy, and then Taiwan is talked about a lot. In fact, all of chapter 7 is about Taiwan. And then the rest of the book is really about China, the Chinese economy, the Chinese military, the leaders, the political system, and things of this nature. The author does give some advice. There's some interesting stuff about the media as well. And so the basic idea is we're going to start with just these kind of lay the scene out, right? Kind of like highlight the things that are going to be important in this book by looking at some of these outside or foreign nations that are intimately involved with China. So we'll start with the United States. It basically says the U.S. would lose face and respect in Asia if they refuse to stand up to Chinese aggression against Taiwan. Now that's really interesting that that's where, at least on my notes, that's the first thing that was entered, first bullet point. It's also the kind of final comments at the end of the book. So it really seems to be a big focus of these authors, talking about Taiwan, talking about possible aggression, either through some events related to Taiwan, something related to Japan, or something related to North Korea. So if you're going to get the book and get all into it, all of Chapter 8 is about the United States, but here's the highlights. May 1999, American bombs the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. But the military of the Americans were already running bombing missions against the Yugoslav government to stop its persecution of the Albanians in Kosovo. Now, what ended up happening, whether it's intentional or just kind of coincidence, I'm sure is debated. But what we know is that 3 Chinese die, 21 are injured. Clinton basically, President Clinton in the United States calls the Chinese president Jiang Zemin. Jiang refuses to take the call. Chinese streets are filled with protesters, despite apologies. There was, like a signed document, I guess, by the Americans. There was all kind of coverage on TV and the public sphere. And all of that, there was kind of help from the American side to assist in recovering those bodies and having them returned to China. Now, protesters actually attacked the United States Embassy in China. And what does Jiang Zemin say in response? He says, well, it is unstoppable when 1.2 billion people are angry. That's page 215. I think that's, isn't that always true? Wouldn't that always be true? Whether there was some problem in Yugoslavia with the Americans, whether there's Chinese citizens attacking the U.S. Embassy in China, no matter what the circumstances are, I think their sheer numbers is an important thing to grasp when thinking about the ruling elite of China. It goes on at the same time there were nonviolent protests occurring in Beijing by the Falun Gong. These were nonviolent protests. Basically, Chinese people believed that this was not an accident in Belgrade, rather that it was an intentional attack by the Americans. Now the problem was that the U.S. was an important trade partner, and too important to lose, actually. So that was kind of the counterweight to the protest. And what we see is that the Chinese textbooks on the history of America followed a Marxist narrative, and that the Americans were basically a story of capitalistic exploitation. So that's interesting, huh? A Marxist narrative. Huh. China strengthens relationships with the United States by the following: agreeing to non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Americans are always thinking of Tiananmen Square massacre, and therefore always think of human rights violations when it comes to China. Americans largely don't know about the names or the stories of the Chinese political prisoners, so kind of some cover-up or distractions. Clinton decided to decouple human rights violations with the interests that they had with trading with China. The Congress presses issues like Tibet. And Zemin was really straddling choices of looking either strong or being friends with the United States. Well, what to do? What to do? Well, how about hosting the Olympics in 2000? How about that as a way to gain popularity, as a way to have international, friendship and interactions like that? I guess interesting, yeah. So there was the World Trade Organization Fiasco. China was trying to enter the World Trade Organization for 13 years. The U.S. Secretary of State was Madeleine Albright, National Security Advisor Sandy Berger, and others. Apparently didn't like this. That's what I'm getting. Chinese people were very upset, and Premier Zhu Rongji returned to Beijing humiliated. So obviously, I guess they didn't get in. So, and then don't forget, that a month later was that event with the bombing of the embassy in Belgrade. So that was pretty bad timing. So basically, Chinese leaders start studying how to manage public upset and states of crisis. In 2003, there was the Sars epidemic, and there was the need for crisis management. Basically, there's inefficiencies of the Chinese government. These are whenever you need to make decisions by a large consensus, whenever you need to run a large propaganda department, it requires, slowness and manipulating the narrative and, the lag time that it takes from like putting out, say, like false information before people really pick up on it and believe it and whatever. And it's difficult to think nationally and internationally at the same time. There was a collision between an American spy plane and a PLA fighter jet. The Chinese pilot died in that crash. The American jet landed in Henan. The plane was disassembled and taken back to the U.S. in parts. Again, students are very upset. They're ready to fight. They're ready to go to war. Never hear about this. Never heard about this. It's very interesting. Chinese company have a bid to buy the Union Oil Company of California, and Lenovo bought IBM's personal computing division. There's also a bid by Harrier to acquire Maytag. So you're starting to see some basically acquisition attempts by Chinese firms, to buy either whole or portions of American companies. And, I think a lot of people would feel threatened by that. Anyways, in Japan, Japan is actually America's close ally, so that's something to think about as we think about how everyone's interacting. North Korea is China's former ally, but not current ally at this time. Looking at the global economy, some things to know to help us understand what we're talking about here. America buys 20% of all Chinese exports, while China loans money to the United States to cover the U.S. budget deficits. Now, if China calls these loans, then interest rates would shoot up significantly in the United States, and that would really cause a stall in the U.S. economy. In an unprecedented, miraculous fashion, China's GDP per capita grew at 9.5% from 1978 to 2004. This didn't happen in other countries. I mean, this has never happened. I think the book calls it like a miracle, just an amazing attempt, to grow 78, 88, 98, 20, 24, 26 years. 26 years to have a GDP growing at 9.5% is really crazy. Some countries have sustained 6% growth rate over a short term as they developed. But China also has a high savings rate. China also has a lot of cheap labor and lots of natural resources. In 2005, the international system of textile and garment quotas ended between Bangladesh and Cambodia, and the guaranteed share of the American and European market. So I guess there was something that was worked out. It expired in 2005, but basically that Americans and Europeans would have to buy so much textiles, so much garments from these two countries here, Cambodia and Bangladesh. So I guess when it expired, that means that then the Americans and Europeans could buy these same goods from China if they wanted to. Now, China is also the number 2 consumer of petroleum in the world. And China has gone to countries like Iran, Venezuela, Sudan, etc. to get their oil in order to always be able to avoid international sanctions from the Americans and the Europeans. Chinese officials state that China can supply 90% of their own energy needs. The U.S. sells U.S. bonds to China in order to create a financial tie, basically. The Americans want the Chinese to be holding large sums of U.S. bonds. The idea is that it creates like a tie between them, shared interest of the other's success, like protection through financial means. So you can understand the relationship between the lender and the borrower, right? There is a relationship there between, especially if you're going to think about that, if it's a repetitive type of interaction. So until 2005, the renminbi the RMB was pegged to the US dollar. That apparently expired in '05 as well. So Americans complain of piracy of intellectual property. China runs its own trade deficit, if not for U.S. purchases, which is really interesting. So that shows us just how important those, American exports are to China. Many countries have a trade surplus, and they're trading with the United States. Basically, the U.S. overspends both on a government level and its citizens as well. So China, the number one destination for foreign investment and the number one exporter of information technology products. Now, going over to Taiwan, this is very important to understanding China and what's going on in all these international interactions. It says it's the most likely flashpoint of military conflict. So the most likely flashpoint of military conflict. Here's some examples. In 1996, China shoots missiles into the water near Taiwan because the U.S. invited Taiwan's president to visit the states for the first time since the U.S. de-recognized Taiwan and established diplomatic relations with China in 1979. Now, we also need to know that Taiwan was colonized by Japan 1895 to 1945, so that ended at the end of World War II, it looks like. Chapter 7 is all about Taiwan, and it says it's a question of regime survival, is the subtitle of that chapter. It says we're working hard to figure out how China can avoid using military force if Taiwan declares independence by referendum. But if the United States doesn't intervene to defend Taiwan, it will lose international credibility. That's page 181. So Taiwan's a big deal because if it, quote, goes independent, it will spark separatist movements in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and maybe even in Inner Mongolia. That's what we're told on page 182. So Taiwan's first elected native leader was a gentleman named Li Zhenghai, the president of Taiwan from 1988 to 2000. Now, Nixon's administration supported Taiwan, and ever since, the U.S. has supported both China and Taiwan. The United States are allowed to sell weapons to Taiwan. This is because Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act to direct the executive branch to continue to defend the island. This is an act that allows the United States to sell weapons to Taiwan. America is interested in the stability of the Middle East. So the book argues that the Chinese people are so emotional about Taiwan because of the Chinese textbooks, the way the Chinese textbooks are written, the things that people believe since they were young about Taiwan. So it's like a very emotional thing for them, which I didn't know, This is why other people don't even realize there's a problem. Taiwan actually poses no military threat. Some argue that the Taiwan issue sells magazines. Could be, I guess. However, it is, quote, universally believed that China and the CCP would fall if it allowed Taiwan to become independent without putting up a fight. And that's page 186. So the Chinese Communist Party would fall. As well as, the whole nation would come undone. So that is really interesting. It's universally believed. And beliefs are powerful. So there's a belief that many common people care more about the economy than the Taiwan issue. But you would be stupid to voice such an opinion openly, as the political elite are married to the ongoing conflict with Taiwan, even if their view lacks broad support or broad public support. It's like, I guess it's woven in to, we'll talk about it later. They talk a lot about how do you control these people, and what kind of narratives do you have to string together, what types of distractions do you have to use, what kind of basically issues are going to be able to bring everyone together. This must be why it's so prevalent in the textbooks. This is just my thoughts as I'm reading through this, but thought I'd share them with you. Near war between China and the United States occurred in 1996 as China seemed to mobilize their military against Taiwan. China would use military force if either the following two things occurred. One, Taiwan formally separated from China, or if foreign countries would invade Taiwan. We also have a quote that says, a lesson that many Chinese took away from the 1995-1996 crisis is that using military force alone against Taiwan is bound to fail. The more threatened Taiwan is, the closer tied to America they will become, which is actually the opposite of China's strategy. So basically the Chinese will need to use some sort of positive force in order to woo the Taiwanese to give up their ideas of independence. So some kind of codependent type relationship, some kind of needed, I don't know, needed resource, needed trade route, needed, I don't know, financial benefit. I don't know, but maybe an outside threat, and that China would protect them. If China would pull that away, that would be just terrible for the Taiwanese. So maybe something like that is what they're saying. So it says China should make Taiwan dependent upon them, and then the threat of removing the blessing is much more powerful than the threat of like harming them. So taking away the carrot instead of harming them in some way or punishing them directly. In 1992, there was a consensus. It allowed each side to define what one China means. So Chen Shui-bian, the president of Taiwan, was reelected in 2004. He was unwilling to send delegates to Beijing or agree to the rhetoric of the 1992 consensus. China passed a law to counter the U.S.'s U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act. China passed what they called an Anti-Secession Law, clarifying when they will use military force, and that military force will not be used in order to coerce reunification. Remember that they're going to need to come up with a different strategy for reunification with Taiwan should they ever lose it, or lose it further, or however you want to say it. In 2006, Chen Shui-bian abolishes the National Unification Council. Ooh, remember he is the president of Taiwan? Yes, the president. So the president of Taiwan abolishes the National Unification Council. The Americans freak out. They start putting pressure. They're claiming that the previous president, Chen, had made the promise not to abolish it, and the Americans are demanding this clarification from the Taiwanese president. Chen's position as president of Taiwan was weakening. Public opinion was low, and there were some problems of corruption involving his family members. The Chinese government's best solution at this point was distraction, focusing on the great promises of economic growth, because the people will not give up the Taiwan issue anytime soon. Moving on, you have China. We're going to focus on the country now. All right, so going back to 1839, the Opium Wars, it says the British defeated China in the Opium Wars. A belief today is that China falls when it has internal strife and external attacks. So, yeah, fighting on two fronts is always hard. So in 1949, Civil War ends with a communist victory, and the Kuomintang retreated to Taiwan. That's 1949. Civil War ends. The Kuomintang retreated to Taiwan. Ever since, China has wanted to gain control of Taiwan. China knows the U.S. will defend Taiwan, and that the war with the United States would actually hurt the Chinese economy. So that's, man, interesting, right? So the People's Republic of China today is a brittle, authoritarian regime that fears its own citizens and can only bend so far to accommodate the demands of foreign governments. And that's a quote from the book. Now, old leaders that are very important to China: Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. So it's probably Xiaoping. I don't know, Xiaoping maybe. Chinese leaders do not run for election, but they can still lose their positions. Communist leaders fear the fall of the communist state, like they saw happen in Germany or other places, Eastern Europe. And their worst nightmare is like a farmer revolt, a student uprising, a worker rebellion. This is just the thing that they're always thinking about because of the numbers. And really, if people were organized and united, they could really cause serious problems with the economy. So China's getting stronger, but how should they best use that strength? One, be preoccupied with domestic problems, try to grow GDP by 7% annually, or should they focus on the outside, especially if pride and conflict with Japan, the U.S., or with Taiwan occurs? What should they do? How should they kind of, craft the narrative that their people are thinking about, the news and everything like that? Always Tiananmen Square protest, 1989. The republic almost crumbled, as there were protests in 132 cities in that year. politicians actually didn't know how to respond. And the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, maybe didn't know how to either. June 4th, 1989, PLA tanks kill thousands in Beijing. Similar events occurred in other cities, and I mean, now no one is allowed to talk about Tiananmen Square. A few months later, the Berlin Wall falls, and so this is like a very tense time. So, possible solutions to their fears. One, avoid public leadership splits. So always give an idea that everyone is united among the leaders. Two, prevent large-scale social unrest. And three, keep the military on the side of the party. Let's look at the Chinese economy. Chinese balance sheet actually has massive amounts of non-performing loans that will never be collected as loans because they've been made to politicians or state-owned businesses that went bankrupt. So they're never going to get this back, this debt, that it's never going to be repaid. Many international banks have started buying portions of Chinese banks and attempting to modernize loan practices. So trying to basically securitize these loans, trying to sell them off, see if it's possible to collect on them at all. I don't know, it sounds very risky, but anyway, the largest economic risks are actually political risks. Chinese Communist Party leaders are acutely aware that they are losing their grip on Chinese society. And that's page 29, a quote. They have mass urbanization, which requires a GDP annual growth rate of no less than 7% in order to create jobs for all these people coming into the cities. And some of the other problems, you have unemployed college graduates. There's this quote that China will grow old before it grows rich. You have this other quote about maintaining social equality. There's also something that we see in the book called the Gini coefficient. It's a measure of inequality, so it's an economic indicator. A measure of inequality where 0 is complete equality. Everyone shares everything perfectly. And a score of 1 would be where like a single person, like a Jeff Bezos or something, actually controls all the assets. So where are these different countries? China is between a 0.46 and a 0.49, so just below the middle point. And officials say that the danger line is at 0.40. So remember, the higher numbers meaning you're concentrating the wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer number of people. So they're really starting to see inequality. A 0.4 is the danger line, which they crossed in 1994. They're now up at like 0.46, 0.49. Some of the other countries, U.S. is actually at 0.41. It'd be really interesting to see where it is now with some of the things that's going on with all this shakeup with 2020, unemployment, things of this nature. Certain companies on the stock market are, yes, doing very, very well. COVID companies, they call them. Other ones, many small businesses are shutting down. People are signing up for unemployment. That's U.S. data. I don't know about China. So U.S. has a 0.41. Germany has a 0.28. So that's good. They're underneath that 0.40 danger line. And the U.K. is at 0.36, so coming up on the danger line. They have very serious pollution, and most people don't have health insurance, and the public health system is really weak, so access to medicine. What about the Chinese military? Experts claim China could muster enough military strength to face U.S. and Taiwan by 2015. Oof. Man. Now, the U.S. military spending is 6 times what all other countries in the world are spending. Important Chinese wars that we should know about. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, so just 2 years. But I think this was very, very terrible, actually. Almost like mentally traumatic in the minds of Chinese people. But the occupation of Manchuria, 1931, the war between Japan and China, 1938 to 1945, which wounded 22 million Chinese people. American bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade and the Nanjing massacre are still kept in the textbooks. And I can't remember which one it is exactly. Yeah, I can't remember which one it is exactly, but I think it was one of the wars with Japan where it was just like so much like raping, so much just brutal. Like it sounded very, very strange in the book. Like just what I've read before, just like extremely odd brutality. Chinese leaders, important ones. 1950, you have Mao Zedong, and his Great Leap Forward. They called it a lunatic campaign. basically forced peasants into huge collective farms, caused the largest famine of the century. Mao starts then the Cultural Revolution in 1966. He closes schools and tells children to be Red Guards, standing up to the bourgeoisie. And everything went crazy, apparently. The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, brings order finally in 1969. So 3 years of real crazy stuff. The army basically takes over and gains control. 1971, Mao ends isolationist stance and reaches out to the United States. Now, 1978, so just a few years later, Deng Xiaoping, I'm sorry, you guys, uh, introduced the market economy and opened China to foreign trade and foreign investment. That's a big shift. Jiang Zemin becomes the leader of the Chinese Communist Party after 1989. Okay, so it looks like Deng was in power for about 11 years. And then Jiang comes in 1989. Remember, that's the Berlin Wall. Remember, that's when all those cities were invaded. That's when the tanks came in and shot all those people all over the place. So 89, real crazy time. Apparently the first year of Jiang's leadership. Then in 2002, you have Hu Jintao becomes leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Apparently the power of the leader has declined significantly since Mao. Jiang Zemin is in between, like in the 1990s and the 2000s. And apparently he was insulted by Japan. The Japanese had given a written apology to the South Koreans for previous war crimes, but they did not give a written apology to the Chinese. The Chinese were only given a verbal apology. And so you could see, especially because that's so deep there, that I really can't explain it to you guys, but I just remember still reading, like, just thinking, wow, either it was the way that the war was described, but just like I said, just the sheer brutality, the raping, just like the ugliness, really sticks out to me compared to what others have written about other wars. And a lot of that depends upon the author, so, I wasn't there, but that's what I gathered as a reader. Now, Chinese politics, basically, the idea is that if you have to censor the media, it's basically a sign that you have a weak hand. You're in a weak position if you need to manipulate, you can't tell the truth. There's 9 members who are the most powerful leaders. They're called the Standing Committee of the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party. And the number one leader holds 3 positions. First position being the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Second position, President of China. Third position, the Chairman of the Central Military Commission. Okay, so one person holds those 3 offices all at the same time. Now, there's significant state control of military and media. So businesses need peace as national economies are interwoven. You have 74,000 mass protests in the year 2004, usually around labor salaries and payment for land seized by the government. What else? Shutdown of pride movements in Mongolia, including the shutdown of rock concerts and chat rooms. Chinese farmers do not have land rights. There's protests over pollution, especially water pollution. There's growing awareness of the gap between the rich and the poor. Chinese nationalists experience themselves not as victims manipulated by the political interest at the state center, but rather as pure patriots who know the truth and will not be fooled. Also, this quote: the students I talk with express their hatred of Japan, their readiness to shed blood to keep Taiwan, and their gripes against America with proud heads held high. A few more things about the Chinese Communist Party. Survival strategies. How to survive. 1. Identify with the protesters. Try to appear as empathetic, interested in their plight. Number 2, co-opt potential oppositional leaders. So maybe buy people off, or get to them first, or, recruit them. Number 3, expand individual freedom. Basically, building appropriate methods for the public to blow off steam, right? However you're going to do that, but some release valve for the upset, the frustration of the people. Number 4, strengthen coercion. So ministries of state security, public security, and justice. You got to have these, and I guess they've got to be some way used to coerce people. And then also the military-affiliated People's Armed Police. Cities are required to have an anti-riot department. So basically, it's not exactly like a police state, but there needs to be like a clear kind of military presence or sense of control. One thing that reminds me of is all those cameras that they put up, where someone told me that the goal was to be able to locate any person in China within 3 minutes. So to have enough, facial recognition and enough cameras everywhere that you can basically track people up to their last location and be able to do that with any person within 3 minutes. I mean, that is mind blowing. Okay, so the fifth strategy for survivalism is to make promises of populism. Put the people first kind of agendas and create a harmonious society. When you talk, when you describe things, when you kind of cast the vision for the people, put it in these terms, promises. Six, sustain growth and appeal to nationalism. So, okay, yeah, basically like keep people happy with playthings or vacations or the latest little thing that they can buy. Now, lesson 3 from chapter 3. Remember, keep the military on the side of the party. Budgets for military spending keep going up. Perhaps they could rival the United States military at some point. Military seems to be hell-bent on getting Taiwan back. It's like a pride thing or something is what I wrote. So the idea, though, that I want you to get is that the military kind of does its own thinking, right? It kind of has its own ideas that are a bit separate. That's why you see this point here, that keep the military on the side of the party. That there's some independence there for the military to think, to voice an opinion, and to maybe act on its own. And so it's really important for the CCP to keep the military in their corner. Now, controlling the media is another big thing. Apparently, this is well done by the party's controls. Many politicians say they feel pressure to align with public opinion, published on the Global Times magazine or on the internet. So that's interesting. Public opinion. People inside the country tend to understand that they must keep with the status quo. We're seeing a change in textbooks as they're coming out now. So like in 2001, the People's Republic of China's Ministry of Education began to revise history textbooks by stripping away some Marxist ideology. China allows more anti-Japanese protest and sentiments in the media than it allows against any other country. So it seems like they're pretty okay with bad things being said about the Japanese. Well, one thing is that the Chinese don't want Japan to become part of the UN Security Council until it properly admits to its historical problems. I'm telling you, there's a real psychological thing that they have in the Chinese people about these war crimes from the past. And that's what I'm saying. I know that's not here in black and white, but that's what I remember. Chinese newspapers were also very critical of lies in the Japanese history textbooks. Due to these reasons, China allows its people to protest openly in the application of Japan to the United Nations Security Council. Chinese leaders would like to, quote unquote, forget the past for pragmatic reasons, right? For maybe trade, for, I don't know. I mean, I don't know who wins really in war, but for these pragmatic reasons. But that the common people will not allow them to respect the Japanese. So there's a big like hatred. I didn't realize that before reading this book. One unifying aspect that brings the Japanese and the Chinese together is their shared concern for the nuclear threat of the North Koreans. So in the final chapter, basically, to outsiders, China looks strong. But to its leaders, it has many internal problems. For the United States, this means that an unsupportive populace could lead to trouble if something occurs with Taiwan or Japan. The author says that the leaders have only to lose control, and a misstep could result in military conflict with America via Taiwan or Japan. So that's the end of my notes. I know it's maybe not super extensive as much as some of those other books, but that's what I took away from it. So I hope that helps. If you read more, if there's things that you thought were very important, leave them in the comment section. What did you think? Did you get that same sense when you were reading about, especially I call it like this psychological grievance that China has with Japan? Is it from the wars? Is it something else? I hope that helps. Please like, subscribe. We're going to be doing more books after we go through a lot of these books for the FSOT. We're still going to be doing stock market evaluation, trying to find some great companies. Northwest Biotherapeutics is one. Very interesting one at this current time. We were able to buy for under $1 a few months ago. And we'll see what happens. Let's see what happens if it goes to $7. Let's see if it goes to $22, as some people are talking about. They're doing a breakthrough cancer treatment for glioblastoma, which is a brain cancer. So we do all kinds of things like that, biopharm, different tech companies. So check us out. Thanks so much.